What happens when a single moment of carelessness collides with decades of military secrets? When Sarah Martinez felt strong hands shove her to the ground outside Club Neptune that Friday night, she had no idea she was about to uncover one of the Pacific Fleet's most closely guarded operations. The man who pushed her, Commander James Wheeler, thought he was just dealing with another annoying civilian. But Sarah wasn't just anyone. She was an investigative journalist with a nose for hidden truths, and the classified documents that spilled from Wheeler's briefcase would expose a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of naval command. Sometimes the most dangerous secrets are revealed not through careful espionage, but through pure accident. This is the story of how one push changed everything. Sarah Martinez adjusted her camera strap as she stepped out of the Uber, the neon lights of Club Neptune casting purple and blue shadows across the crowded sidewalk. The bass from inside the club thumped against the brick walls, and groups of young professionals clustered around the entrance, their laughter mixing with the distant sound of waves crashing against the San Diego shore. It was nearly midnight on a Friday, and the club district was alive with energy. She wasn't here for fun. Sarah had been tracking a story for 3 months about suspicious financial transactions involving local military contractors. Her editor at the San Diego Tribune had been skeptical, but Sarah's instincts told her something bigger was happening beneath the surface. Tonight, she was meeting Marcus Chun, a former Navy accountant who claimed he had information about irregularities in Pacific Fleet procurement contracts. The crowd outside the club was thick with Navy personnel from the nearby base. San Diego's nightlife had always been intertwined with the military presence, and Club Neptune was particularly popular with officers and enlisted personnel alike. Sarah recognized the telltale signs, the precise haircuts, the confident postures, the way groups of men moved together with military precision even in civilian clothes. She checked her phone. Marcus was 10 minutes late. Sarah decided to wait by the club's side entrance, away from the main crowd. The alley was dimly lit, with only a single streetlight casting long shadows between the buildings. She pulled out her notebook and reviewed her questions, her pen moving quickly across the page in the orange glow of the streetlight. Commander James Wheeler had been having the worst week of his career. The classified operation he'd been overseeing for the past 2 years was under internal review, and his superiors were asking uncomfortable questions. The briefcase in his hand contained documents that could destroy not just his career, but potentially compromise national security if they fell into the wrong hands. He'd spent the evening at Club Neptune trying to clear his head, but the alcohol had only made his anxiety worse. As he stumbled out the side exit, his mind was racing through worst-case scenarios. The Pacific Fleet's Operation Silent Current was supposed to be foolproof, but somehow word was leaking out. There had been too many questions from reporters lately, too many coincidences. His commanding officer, Admiral Richardson, had made it clear that Wheeler's head would roll if there were any security breaches. The briefcase felt heavier with each step. Inside were deployment schedules, financial records, and communication protocols for a covert surveillance operation that had been running for nearly 3 years. The operation involved monitoring Chinese naval movements in the South China Sea using a network of civilian contractors and modified fishing vessels. If exposed, it could create a diplomatic nightmare and potentially endanger the lives of undercover operatives. Wheeler's vision was blurry from the alcohol, and he was fumbling with his phone, trying to call his driver, when he noticed someone standing in the shadows near the alley entrance. In his paranoid state, every civilian looked like a potential threat, every journalist like a spy waiting to expose him. Sarah looked up from her notebook as she heard footsteps approaching. A man in his early 40s was walking unsteadily toward the street, dressed in expensive civilian clothes, but carrying himself with unmistakable military bearing. Even in the dim light, she could see the stress lines around his eyes and the way his knuckles were white as he gripped a leather briefcase. Something about his demeanor caught her attention. This wasn't the relaxed posture of someone leaving a night out at the club. This was someone carrying the weight of serious responsibility, someone who looked like he hadn't slept well in weeks. Her journalist instincts kicked in immediately. As Wheeler got closer, Sarah realized she recognized him from her research. She'd seen his photo in naval publications and official Pacific Fleet press releases. This was Commander James Wheeler, the officer in charge of logistics coordination for Pacific Fleet operations. What was he doing stumbling at a nightclub at midnight, clearly intoxicated, carrying what looked like official documents? She started to step forward, her reporter's curiosity overriding her caution. "Commander Wheeler?" she called out, her voice carrying clearly in the quiet alley. Wheeler's head snapped up at the sound of his name. Through his alcohol-clouded vision, he saw a woman with a camera and notebook approaching him. Every alarm bell in his head started ringing. "Reporter." The word flashed through his mind like a red warning light. This was exactly what Admiral Richardson had warned him about. The press was getting too close, asking too many questions about Pacific Fleet operations. Without thinking clearly, Wheeler's military training kicked in. Eliminate the threat. Protect the mission. His rational mind, dulled by alcohol and stress, failed to consider that this might be an innocent encounter. All he saw was a potential security breach walking toward him in the form of a woman with a camera. Sarah took another step forward, her press credentials visible around her neck. "Commander, I'm Sarah Martinez from the San Diego Tribune. I was wondering if you might have a moment to comment on some questions about Pacific Fleet procurement." That was as far as she got before Wheeler's paranoia took complete control. In his intoxicated state, her words sounded like an accusation, like she already knew about Operation Silent Current. The briefcase in his hand suddenly felt like it was on fire, its contents screaming to be protected at all costs. "Stay away from me," Wheeler slurred, taking a step backward. "You people don't know when to quit." Sarah raised her hands in a peaceful gesture. "Commander, I just want to ask a few questions about some financial irregularities that..." Wheeler's military instincts overrode his common sense. Without warning, he lunged forward and shoved Sarah hard in the chest with his free hand. The force of the push sent her stumbling backward, her feet catching on the uneven pavement. She fell hard, her camera flying from her hands and skittering across the concrete. Her notebook scattered its pages in the wind. But Wheeler's aggressive move had an unintended consequence. The briefcase in his other hand wasn't properly secured, and the force of his lunge caused it to swing open. Classified documents spilled out onto the pavement like autumn leaves, their official seals and red top secret stamps clearly visible even in the dim streetlight. Sarah hit the ground hard, her palms scraping against the rough concrete. Pain shot through her wrists and knees, but her attention was immediately drawn to the papers scattered around her. Even upside down and in poor light, she could make out official Navy letterheads, classified markings, and what appeared to be operational schedules and financial records. Wheeler realized what had happened a moment too late. He dropped to his knees, frantically trying to gather the scattered documents, but his intoxicated state made his movements clumsy and ineffective. Sarah, despite her pain, had the presence of mind to reach for her camera, which had landed just a few feet away. "Don't you dare," Wheeler growled, still scrambling to collect papers. "Those are classified. You can't look at those." But Sarah had already seen enough. Among the scattered documents, she glimpsed references to Operation Silent Current, budget allocations for civilian maritime assets, and what appeared to be communication schedules with call signs she didn't recognize. Her journalist training kicked in immediately. This was bigger than her original story about procurement irregularities. Wheeler managed to stuff most of the documents back into his briefcase, but he knew it was too late. The reporter had seen them, possibly even photographed them. His career was over, and potentially much worse than that. If Admiral Richardson found out about this security breach, Wheeler would be lucky to avoid a court-martial. Sarah slowly got to her feet, her knees wobbly, but her mind sharp. She could feel the adrenaline coursing through her veins as she realized the magnitude of what had just happened. This wasn't just about financial irregularities anymore. This was about classified military operations, and the man who had just assaulted her was clearly trying to hide something significant. "Commander Wheeler," she said, her voice steady despite her injuries. "I think we need to talk." Wheeler looked up at her with eyes full of panic and fury. The alcohol was starting to wear off, replaced by the cold reality of what had just transpired. He had assaulted a civilian journalist and potentially exposed classified information in the process. There was no coming back from this. "You don't understand," he said, his voice taking on a pleading tone. "Those documents, if that information gets out, people could die. Operations could be compromised." Sarah studied his face in the streetlight. Despite his aggressive actions, she could see genuine fear there. Not just fear for his career, but fear for something much larger. Her instincts told her that Commander Wheeler wasn't just a corrupt officer trying to cover up financial fraud. He was involved in something that went to the heart of national security. The sound of voices from the club's main entrance reminded both of them that they weren't alone. Other people would be coming down this alley soon, and neither of them wanted witnesses to what had just happened. Wheeler for obvious reasons, and Sarah because she needed time to process what she'd seen and decide how to handle it. "My car is around the corner," Wheeler said quietly. "We need to talk, but not here." Sarah hesitated. Getting into a car with a man who had just pushed her to the ground wasn't exactly smart, but she could see that Wheeler was more scared than dangerous now. And if she was going to get to the bottom of this story, she needed to understand what he was so desperate to hide. "5 minutes," she said, "and I'm keeping my phone on." Wheeler nodded, relief flooding his face. As they walked toward his car, Sarah's mind was already racing ahead, trying to piece together what she'd glimpsed in those scattered documents. Operation Silent Current. Civilian Maritime Assets. Communication schedules with unknown call signs. She had stumbled onto something much bigger than financial irregularities. The question now was whether she was brave enough to see where it led, and whether Commander Wheeler would help her or try to stop her. As they reached his car, Sarah realized that her Friday night had just taken a turn that would change both of their lives forever. The Pacific Fleet's most closely guarded secret was about to be exposed, all because one paranoid officer had pushed the wrong reporter at the wrong time. Sometimes the biggest stories come not from careful investigation, but from pure accident. And sometimes those accidents change everything. Wheeler's hands shook as he unlocked his black sedan, the keys making a metallic rattling sound in the quiet alley. Sarah noticed the military base parking sticker on his windshield and the pristine condition of the car's interior. Everything about Commander Wheeler screamed military precision, except for his current state of barely controlled panic. "Get in," he said, glancing nervously toward the club entrance. "We can't stay here." Sarah climbed into the passenger seat, her scraped palms stinging as she gripped the door handle. The car smelled like leather cleaner and coffee, with an underlying tension that seemed to emanate from Wheeler himself. As he started the engine, she noticed his hands were still trembling. "Where are we going?" she asked, buckling her seatbelt while keeping her phone visible in her lap. "Somewhere we can talk without being overheard," Wheeler replied, pulling out of the alley and onto the main street. The neon lights of the club district flashed across his windshield as they drove through the late-night crowd. "What I'm about to tell you could get us both killed." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine, but journalist instincts were stronger than her fear. "Then maybe you should start from the beginning." Wheeler drove in silence for several minutes, navigating through the downtown San Diego traffic toward the waterfront. Sarah used the time to study his profile in the passing streetlights. His jaw was clenched tight, and she could see a muscle twitching near his temple. This wasn't just about career concerns. Whatever Operation Silent Current involved, it had Wheeler genuinely terrified. They pulled into an empty parking lot overlooking San Diego Bay. The lights of Coronado Island twinkled across the dark water, and in the distance, Sarah could see the silhouettes of naval vessels anchored at the base. Wheeler turned off the engine and sat in silence for a long moment, staring out at the water. 3 years ago, he finally said, "Admiral Richardson came to me with what he called a special assignment." The Chinese Navy had been increasing their presence in the South China Sea, and traditional surveillance methods weren't giving us the intelligence we needed. Sarah pulled out her notebook, but Wheeler immediately reached over and stopped her hand. "Nothing written down," he said sharply. "Not yet. First, you need to understand what you've stumbled into." She nodded and put the notebook away, committing every word to memory instead. Wheeler continued, his voice low and measured. The operation was called Silent Current. On the surface, it looked like a routine Pacific Fleet logistics coordination program. But in reality, we were running a network of civilian fishing vessels and cargo ships equipped with sophisticated surveillance equipment. Spying on Chinese naval movements, Sarah said, the pieces beginning to fall into place. "Not just movements," Wheeler replied. "Communications, deployment patterns, new technology testing. We had assets throughout the South China Sea feeding us real-time intelligence on Chinese military activities." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. This was the kind of story that could define a career or end one, depending on how she handled it. How many people knew about this operation? "Maybe 20 at the highest levels of Pacific Fleet Command," Wheeler said. The civilian contractors thought they were just carrying upgraded navigation equipment. Only a handful of people knew the true purpose. And the financial irregularities I was investigating, Wheeler let out a bitter laugh. Those weren't irregularities. They were payments to our civilian assets. Fishing boat captains, cargo ship owners, port facility managers, all getting compensated for carrying our equipment and feeding us information. Sarah stared out at the water, trying to process the implications. "So you're telling me the U.S. Navy has been running an unauthorized surveillance operation in international waters using civilian cover?" "Not unauthorized," Wheeler said quickly. "This came directly from Pacific Fleet Command with approval from the Pentagon. But it was strictly compartmentalized. Need-to-know basis only." "Then why are you so scared?" Sarah asked. "If this was an approved operation, what's the problem?" Wheeler's expression darkened. "Because 3 weeks ago, one of our assets went dark. The MV Prosperity, a cargo vessel based out of Manila, stopped reporting. When we sent a team to investigate, they found the ship abandoned in international waters." Sarah felt a chill run through her. "What happened to the crew?" "That's what we're trying to figure out," Wheeler said. "But here's the thing. The surveillance equipment was gone, but not damaged or destroyed. It was carefully removed by someone who knew exactly what they were looking for." The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. "You think the Chinese discovered the operation?" "We don't know. Wheeler admitted. But if they did, and if they have our equipment, they can reverse engineer our entire surveillance network. Every asset we have in the South China Sea could be compromised. Sarah's mind raced through the possibilities. If the Chinese had indeed discovered and captured American surveillance equipment, it would be a massive intelligence failure. But more than that, it would be a diplomatic nightmare that could escalate tensions between the two superpowers. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Why risk everything by talking to a reporter?" Wheeler was quiet for a long moment, his hands gripping the steering wheel even though the car was parked. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Because I think someone on our side sold us out." Sarah felt her breath catch. "What do you mean?" "The Prosperity didn't just go dark," Wheeler continued. "Our intelligence suggests the ship was boarded by Chinese naval forces at a very specific time and location. Information that would only be available to someone with high-level access to our operational schedules." "You're talking about a mole inside Pacific Fleet Command." "I'm talking about treason," Wheeler said bluntly. "Someone with access to Operation Silent Current gave the Chinese everything they needed to capture our assets and compromise our entire network." Sarah stared at him in the dim light of the parking lot. "Do you have proof?" Wheeler reached into his briefcase and pulled out a single document, one that had scattered to the ground earlier, but which Sarah hadn't gotten a good look at. Even in the poor light, she could see it was a communication log with timestamps and call signs. "This shows the last communications from the Prosperity," Wheeler said, pointing to specific entries. "According to this log, the ship was ordered to change course and proceed to a rendezvous point that wasn't part of their original mission." Sarah studied the document carefully. "Who gave that order?" "That's what I've been trying to figure out," Wheeler replied. "The communication came through proper channels with the correct authentication codes. But when I traced it back through the system, the original source was masked. Someone with high-level access to your communication systems. Someone who knew exactly how to hide their tracks," Wheeler confirmed. "Admiral Richardson has been conducting his own investigation, but so far we've come up empty. Whoever did this is very good at covering their tracks." Sarah leaned back in the passenger seat, trying to process everything Wheeler had told her. The story had evolved from simple financial irregularities to a major intelligence operation to potential treason at the highest levels of the military. It was the kind of investigation that could take months to unravel, assuming she could find a way to verify Wheeler's claims independently. "Why come forward now?" she asked. "What changed?" Wheeler's expression grew even more troubled. "Because yesterday we lost another asset. The fishing vessel Lucky Dragon, operating out of Taiwan. Same pattern. Went dark suddenly. Found abandoned surveillance equipment missing. The mole is still active." "Not just active," Wheeler said grimly. "Escalating. If this continues, we could lose our entire intelligence network in the South China Sea. And if the Chinese are gathering our equipment, they're learning how to detect and counter our surveillance methods." Sarah realized the broader implications, which means future operations could be compromised too. "Exactly," Wheeler confirmed. "This isn't just about one covert operation. This could fundamentally alter the balance of power in the Pacific." They sat in silence for several minutes, both lost in thought. Sarah was mentally cataloging the sources she would need to contact and the verification she would require before she could publish anything. Wheeler seemed to be wrestling with his decision to involve her in the first place. Finally, Sarah spoke. "If you suspect there's a mole in Pacific Fleet Command, why not handle this internally? Why bring in a civilian reporter?" Wheeler turned to look at her directly. "Because I don't know who I can trust anymore. Admiral Richardson is conducting his investigation, but what if the mole is someone close to him? What if the mole is him?" The accusation hung in the air between them like a dangerous secret. Sarah realized that Wheeler wasn't just sharing information with her. He was using her as insurance, a way to ensure the truth came out even if something happened to him. You think Admiral Richardson might be the traitor? I think anyone with high-level access to Operation Silent Current could be the traitor, Wheeler replied. That includes Richardson, Deputy Admiral Morrison, Intelligence Chief Captain Torres, and about 15 other senior officers. Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. Wheeler was essentially asking her to investigate potential treason within the highest levels of the Pacific Fleet, using only the information he could provide and whatever independent verification she could obtain. "What do you want from me?" she asked directly. "I want you to investigate this story properly," Wheeler said. "Use your journalistic resources to verify what I'm telling you. Find independent sources. Follow the money trail. And if you can prove that someone in Pacific Fleet Command is selling out our operations, publish it. And if I can't prove it," Wheeler's expression was grim, "then more assets will disappear, more intelligence will be compromised, and eventually the Chinese will have enough of our technology to neutralize our entire surveillance capability in the Pacific." Sarah understood the stakes now. This wasn't just about exposing a covert operation. It was about national security, military intelligence, and potentially preventing a major shift in naval power in one of the world's most strategically important regions. "I'll need access to documents, sources inside the military, financial records," she said. "This isn't something I can investigate based on one conversation in a parking lot." Wheeler reached into his briefcase again and pulled out a small USB drive. "This contains copies of the operational schedules, communication logs, and financial records for Operation Silent Current. It's everything I could safely copy without triggering security alerts." Sarah stared at the drive in his outstretched hand. Taking it would make her a party to the disclosure of classified information, potentially making her a target for criminal prosecution. But it would also give her the documentation she needed to pursue the story properly. "If I take this, there's no going back," she said. "If you don't take this, there might not be anything to go back to," Wheeler replied. "The next asset we lose might be carrying equipment that could compromise operations across the entire Pacific theater." Sarah took the USB drive, feeling its small weight like it contained the future of her career and possibly her freedom. "How do I contact you if I need more information?" Wheeler pulled out a business card and wrote a phone number on the back. "This is my personal cell phone. But be careful. If there really is a mole in Pacific Fleet Command, they might be monitoring communications." As Wheeler started the engine to drive her back to her car, Sarah realized that her investigation into minor financial irregularities had just become something much larger and more dangerous than she had ever imagined. The classified documents on the USB drive in her pocket could expose a major intelligence operation, reveal potential treason, or get her killed. Possibly all three. The next phase of her investigation would require extreme caution, impeccable sources, and the kind of careful verification that could take weeks or months. But as they drove back through the quiet streets of San Diego, Sarah knew she was committed to seeing this story through to its conclusion, wherever that might lead. Sarah sat in her apartment at 3 a.m, staring at the USB drive on her kitchen table like it might explode at any moment. The events of the evening felt surreal. The confrontation with Commander Wheeler, the scattered classified documents, the revelation about Operation Silent Current. Her scraped palms were a physical reminder that it had all been very real. She made coffee with shaking hands and opened her laptop. The USB drive contained more information than she had expected. Dozens of files with names like SC_deployment_schedule_Q3 and Maritime Communications Info Log. Even without opening them, Sarah knew she was looking at enough classified material to land her in federal prison if she handled it wrong. But she was also looking at the story of a lifetime. Sarah had built her reputation as an investigative journalist by being methodical and careful. She never published anything without multiple independent sources and rock-solid verification. The information Wheeler had given her was explosive, but it was also coming from a single source who was clearly under enormous stress and had been drinking. She needed to verify everything before she could even begin to think about publication. She started by researching Commander James Wheeler himself. His official Pacific Fleet biography painted the picture of a decorated officer with 20 years of service, multiple commendations, and a spotless record. His LinkedIn profile was sparse, but consistent with his military background. There were no red flags that would suggest he was unstable or prone to fabrication. Next, she searched for any public information about Operation Silent Current. As expected, there was nothing. If Wheeler was telling the truth, this was a highly classified operation that wouldn't appear in any public records. But Sarah had learned over the years that even the most secret operations left traces if you knew where to look. She began with shipping records and maritime insurance databases, looking for patterns that might indicate unusual activity among fishing vessels and cargo ships in the South China Sea. It was tedious work, but after 2 hours, she found something interesting. Several vessels that had recently filed insurance claims for navigation equipment replacement in ports throughout the Philippines, Taiwan, and Vietnam. The timing was significant. All of the claims had been filed within the past 6 weeks, which coincided with Wheeler's timeline for when Operation Silent Current assets had started disappearing. Sarah cross-referenced the vessel names with maritime tracking databases and found something even more interesting. Many of these ships had been following unusual routes that took them through areas known for Chinese naval activity. By 6 in the morning, Sarah had compiled a preliminary list of 12 vessels that showed patterns consistent with Wheeler's description of silent current assets. It wasn't proof, but it was independent verification that something unusual was happening in the South China Sea maritime traffic. Her next step was to find sources within the military who could confirm or deny Wheeler's claims without knowing they were doing so. Sarah had cultivated contacts throughout the San Diego military community over her 5 years covering the defense beat, and she knew which officers were likely to be aware of classified operations, even if they weren't directly involved. She started with Captain Maria Santos, a public affairs officer who had always been straight with her. Sarah called Santos around 8 in the morning, catching her just as she was arriving at the base. "Sarah," Santos said, sounding pleased to hear from her. "What can I do for you this fine Saturday morning?" "I'm working on a story about Pacific Fleet logistics operations," Sarah said carefully. "I've heard some rumors about increased coordination with civilian maritime assets in the South China Sea. Can you tell me anything about that?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Santos spoke again, her tone was noticeably cooler. "Sarah, you know I can't discuss operational details, especially regarding activities in sensitive regions." "I'm not looking for specifics," Sarah pressed. "Just general confirmation about whether the Pacific Fleet has been working more closely with civilian vessels for logistic support." "I think you should direct those questions through official channels," Santos replied. "Submit a formal request for information, and we'll see what we can declassify for you." The conversation ended politely but abruptly. Santos' reaction told Sarah 2 important things. There was indeed something happening with civilian maritime assets in the South China Sea, and it was sensitive enough that even discussing it made experienced public affairs officers nervous. Sarah spent the rest of the morning making similar calls to other military contacts. The pattern was consistent. As soon as she mentioned civilian maritime assets or South China Sea operations, conversations became guarded and brief. Nobody would confirm anything directly, but their reactions confirmed that Wheeler hadn't been making things up. By noon, Sarah decided she needed to take a more direct approach. She drove to the marina where many off-duty Navy personnel kept their boats and started talking to sailors and officers in casual settings. Her cover story was that she was working on a feature about how military families spent their recreational time, which gave her an excuse to strike up conversations. It was at the marina that she met Petty Officer First Class Rodriguez, who had been working port logistics for the past 2 years. Rodriguez was relaxed and talkative, apparently enjoying the break from base routine. "You know what's been weird lately?" Rodriguez said as they chatted near the boat slips. "We've been getting a lot more civilian vessels requesting port services. Fishing boats, cargo haulers, stuff like that. Usually they stick to civilian facilities, but lately they've been coming to us for fuel and repairs." Sarah kept her expression neutral. "That does sound unusual. Any idea why?" Rodriguez shrugged. "Above my pay grade. But I heard some of the senior chiefs talking about how these civilian contracts are all coming through special authorization channels. Real hush-hush stuff." "Special authorization from where?" "Pacific Fleet Command, I think. All I know is that when these vessels come in, we're supposed to give them priority service and not ask questions about their cargo or equipment." Sarah felt a surge of excitement. This was independent confirmation of at least part of Wheeler's story. The Pacific Fleet was indeed working closely with civilian maritime assets, and there was an unusual level of secrecy surrounding these operations. She spent the rest of the afternoon at the marina, talking to more personnel and gradually building a picture of increased military-civilian maritime cooperation. Nobody mentioned Operation Silent Current by name, but the pattern Wheeler had described was clearly visible to anyone who knew what to look for. As evening approached, Sarah returned to her apartment to review the information she had gathered. Between her database research, the reactions from her military contacts, and the conversations at the marina, she had enough independent verification to feel confident that Wheeler's basic claims about a covert surveillance operation were accurate. But verifying the existence of Operation Silent Current was only the beginning. The real story was Wheeler's claim that someone inside Pacific Fleet Command was betraying the operation to the Chinese. That would require a much deeper investigation and much more dangerous sources. Sarah decided her next step would be to try to make contact with intelligence personnel who might have knowledge of the missing assets Wheeler had described. She knew this would be risky. Intelligence officers were typically more security conscious and less likely to talk to reporters, even accidentally. She began by researching the 2 vessels Wheeler had mentioned, the MV Prosperity and the fishing vessel Lucky Dragon. Public maritime databases showed that both vessels were registered in the Philippines and Taiwan respectively, but there were few other details available online. However, Sarah's research did reveal something interesting about the MV Prosperity. The ship had been involved in a minor collision with another vessel 6 months earlier, and the insurance report contained detailed information about the cargo it had been carrying at the time. According to the report, the Prosperity had been carrying specialized navigation and communication equipment, in addition to its regular cargo. The description was vague, but it was consistent with Wheeler's claim that civilian vessels were being equipped with surveillance gear disguised as navigation equipment. More importantly, the insurance report listed the company that had provided the specialized equipment, a firm called Pacific Maritime Solutions, based in San Diego. Sarah had never heard of Pacific Maritime Solutions, but A quick search revealed that it was a small company specializing in advanced maritime communication systems for commercial and government clients. The company's website was sparse on details, but it listed several contracts with federal agencies without specifying which ones. This was exactly the kind of front company that would be used to provide cover for a covert operation. Sarah made a note to investigate Pacific Maritime Solutions more thoroughly, but she realized she would need to be extremely careful. If Wheeler was right about there being a mole in the operation, then the people running the surveillance network might be watching for anyone who got too close to the truth. As she pondered her next move, Sarah's phone rang. The caller ID showed Wheeler's number. "We need to meet," Wheeler said without preamble. "Something's happened." "What kind of something?" "Not over the phone," Wheeler replied. "Same place as last night, 1 hour." The line went dead. Sarah stared at her phone, feeling a familiar mixture of excitement and apprehension. Whatever had prompted Wheeler's urgent call, she suspected it was going to move her investigation into an even more dangerous phase. She grabbed her camera and notebook and headed for the door, making sure to take the USB drive with her. If Wheeler had new information about the mole he suspected or about additional assets that had been compromised, Sarah wanted to be ready to document everything properly. As she drove toward the waterfront, Sarah's mind raced through the possibilities. In the space of 24 hours, her investigation had evolved from financial irregularities to covert surveillance operations to potential treason. She had the feeling that Wheeler's urgent call was about to push the story into even more dangerous territory. The sun was setting over San Diego Bay as Sarah pulled into the same parking lot where they had met the night before. Wheeler was already there, sitting in his car with the engine running. When she approached his vehicle, she could see that he looked even more stressed than he had the previous evening. "Get in," he said as soon as she reached his car. "We don't have much time." Sarah climbed in the passenger seat and immediately noticed that Wheeler had several new documents spread across his dashboard. Even in the fading light, she could see they bore the same official seals and classification markings as the papers that had scattered the night before. "What happened?" she asked. Wheeler's hands were shaking as he sorted through the papers. "This morning, Admiral Richardson called an emergency briefing for all senior staff with silent current clearance. He announced that the operation is being shut down immediately." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. "Why?" "Because we lost another asset last night," Wheeler said grimly. "The cargo vessel New Horizon, operating out of Vietnam. But this time it wasn't just the surveillance equipment that disappeared." "What do you mean?" Wheeler looked at her with an expression of barely controlled panic. "The entire crew is missing. 15 people just gone. The Vietnamese Coast Guard found the ship adrift this morning with no signs of struggle, no distress signals, no indication of what happened to the crew." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. The stakes had just escalated dramatically. What had started as a potential intelligence failure was now involving the disappearance of civilian personnel who had been working unknowingly for the U.S. military. "Do you think they were taken prisoner?" she asked. "We don't know," Wheeler admitted. "But here's what really scared Richardson. The ship's communication logs show that the New Horizon received new orders just 6 hours before it went dark. Orders that directed it to a rendezvous point that wasn't on any official schedule." Sarah realized the implications immediately. The same pattern as the previous vessels. "Exactly," Wheeler confirmed. "Someone with access to our communication systems is feeding information to the Chinese, and now it's not just equipment that's being lost, it's people." As Wheeler continued to brief her on the latest developments, Sarah understood that her investigation had crossed a crucial threshold. She was no longer just investigating a potential intelligence breach. She was investigating what might be kidnapping, or worse, of innocent civilians who had been caught up in a covert military operation. The story that had begun with a chance encounter outside a nightclub was becoming something much larger and more dangerous than Sarah had ever imagined. And with 15 missing crew members, the stakes had become literally a matter of life and death. The missing crew of the New Horizon changed everything. What Sarah had initially viewed as an intelligence story had become something far more urgent and personal. 15 civilian crew members, fathers, sons, breadwinners for families across Vietnam, had vanished while unknowingly serving American military interests. The weight of their disappearance pressed on Sarah's conscience as she and Wheeler reviewed the latest intelligence reports in his car. Richardson is calling it a total security failure, Wheeler said, his voice tight with stress. The entire Operation Silent Current network is being rolled up as of tonight. Every civilian asset is being contacted and told to return to port immediately. Sarah studied the documents spread across the dashboard. The communication logs from the New Horizon told a chilling story. At 0400 hours local time, the vessel had received what appeared to be legitimate orders to proceed to coordinates in international waters between Vietnam and the Philippines. The authentication codes were correct. The transmission format matched standard Pacific Fleet protocols, and the orders had come through established communication channels. 6 hours later, the ship had gone dark. Have you been able to trace the source of these false orders? Sarah asked. Wheeler shook his head grimly. That's what's so sophisticated about this. The orders didn't come from outside the system. They came from within our own communication network. Someone with legitimate access to Pacific Fleet systems is using that access to feed our assets directly to Chinese forces. Sarah felt a chill as the full implication sank in. They're not just stealing intelligence. They're using your own command structure to deliver assets right into Chinese hands. And now we have proof, Wheeler said, pulling out another document. This came in 3 hours ago. Satellite imagery from the coordinates where the New Horizon was ordered to rendezvous. Sarah studied the grainy black and white photograph. Even with her limited experience reading satellite imagery, she could make out what appeared to be 2 vessels in close proximity. One was clearly the New Horizon based on its size and configuration. The other was a larger vessel that Wheeler identified as a Chinese naval ship. The timestamp shows this image was taken approximately 2 hours after the New Horizon went dark, Wheeler explained. By the time we got search and rescue teams to the area, both vessels were gone. The evidence was now undeniable. Someone within Pacific Fleet Command was actively collaborating with Chinese forces to compromise American intelligence assets. But more than that, they were now responsible for the apparent capture of innocent civilian personnel. Sarah's mind raced through the implications for her investigation. The story was no longer just about military intelligence. It was about human lives hanging in the balance. If she was going to publish anything about Operation Silent Current, she would need to do it in a way that might help save the missing crew members rather than endanger them further. What's Admiral Richardson's plan now? She asked. Wheeler's expression darkened. That's where things get complicated. Richardson has ordered a complete internal investigation to find the mole, but he's also implemented a total information lockdown. Nobody talks to anyone outside Pacific Fleet Command about Silent Current. Anyone who leaks information faces court-martial, including you. Especially me, Wheeler confirmed. Richardson knows that documents were compromised during my encounter with you last night. He hasn't directly accused me of anything yet, but I'm under increased scrutiny. Sarah realized that Wheeler was taking enormous personal risks by continuing to share information with her. If Admiral Richardson discovered that Wheeler was feeding intelligence to a civilian reporter, his military career would be over, and he would likely face criminal prosecution. "Why are you still talking to me?" she asked directly. "You could stop right now, claim you were drunk and made a mistake, and probably survive the internal investigation." Wheeler was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the dark water of San Diego Bay. When he spoke, his voice was heavy with conviction. "Because 15 people are missing, and I don't think Richardson's internal investigation is going to find them," he said. "The mole has been operating successfully for months, maybe years. They know how our security protocols work. They know how to cover their tracks, and they probably know about Richardson's investigation." Sarah understood Wheeler's logic. If the traitor was indeed someone within the highest levels of Pacific Fleet Command, they would be well-positioned to stay ahead of any internal investigation. An external investigation by a journalist, using different methods and sources, might be the only way to expose the truth. But it was also incredibly dangerous for everyone involved. "What do you need from me?" Sarah asked. Wheeler pulled out a new folder of documents, materials he had clearly gathered since their previous meeting. "I need you to help me identify who has the access and opportunity to be feeding information to the Chinese. I've compiled a list of everyone with silent current clearance, their access levels, and their recent activities." Sarah opened the folder and found herself looking at personnel files for 18 senior Pacific Fleet officers, including Admiral Richardson himself. Each file contained security clearance information, duty assignments, travel records, and financial disclosure forms. "You want me to help you investigate your own colleagues for treason. I want you to help me find the person who's responsible for 15 missing civilians," Wheeler corrected, "and who might be responsible for many more if we don't stop them." Sarah studied the files, recognizing several names from her years covering the military beat. These were distinguished officers with decades of service and impeccable reputations. The idea that one of them might be a Chinese agent seemed almost impossible to believe. But the evidence was clear. Someone with high-level access was systematically betraying American intelligence operations. "How do we narrow down the suspects?" Sarah asked. Wheeler had clearly been thinking about this question extensively. "We look for three things: access, opportunity, and motive. Access means they have clearance for silent current operational details. Opportunity means they were in position to send the false orders that led to asset losses. And motive means they have some reason to betray their country." Sarah nodded, understanding the investigative framework. "Let's start with access. Who had clearance for the specific operational schedules that were compromised?" Wheeler pulled out a classification matrix that showed clearance levels for different aspects of Operation Silent Current. "For the level of detail needed to send convincing false orders, we're looking at maybe 8 people," he said, circling names on the chart. The list included Admiral Richardson, Deputy Admiral Morrison, Intelligence Chief Captain Torres, Operations Chief Captain Bradley, Communications Director Commander Nash, Security Chief Commander Park, Logistics Coordinator Major Kim, and Supply Chain Manager Lieutenant Colonel Hayes. 8 suspects, Sarah said, studying the names. "That's manageable for an investigation. Now we look at opportunity," Wheeler continued. "The false orders were sent during specific time windows when the suspects would have needed to be physically present at Pacific Fleet Command facilities with access to secure communication systems." Wheeler produced another document, a duty roster and security logs showing when each of the 8 suspects had been at their posts during the times when compromised orders were sent. The data showed that all 8 suspects had been present during at least one of the 3 incidents, but only 4 had been present for all 3. Admiral Richardson, Captain Torres, Commander Nash, and Major Kim, Sarah read from Wheeler's analysis. These 4 are the only ones who were definitely in position to send false orders in all 3 cases. Wheeler nodded grimly. 4 suspects, including the man in charge of the entire operation. Sarah felt the weight of the investigation settling on her shoulders. She was being asked to help determine which of 4 distinguished military officers might be committing treason. The stakes couldn't be higher, not just for the missing crew members, but for national security and the lives of everyone involved in the investigation. What about motive, she asked. Money, ideology, blackmail. What would make one of these officers betray their country? Wheeler spread out financial disclosure forms for all 4 suspects. I've been going through their finances, looking for anything unusual. Large debts, unexplained income, gambling problems, anything that might make them vulnerable to foreign recruitment. Sarah studied the financial documents, noting that all 4 officers appeared to live within their military salaries. There were no obvious red flags like expensive cars, luxury homes, or unusual investment portfolios. They all look clean financially, she observed. Which means if there is a mole, they're either very good at hiding their payments or they're not motivated by money, Wheeler replied. That suggests either ideological commitment to China or some form of blackmail. Sarah realized they needed to dig deeper into the personal lives of the suspects. Family connections, travel history, relationships, anything that might reveal vulnerability to foreign influence. It was the kind of investigation that would require extensive research and possibly surveillance. I can help with the research, Sarah said, but I'll need access to more than just military records. Social media, financial databases, property records, court filings, the kind of background information that might not show up in official personnel files. Wheeler nodded. I can provide what military records I can access safely, but you'll have to handle the civilian research. And, Sarah, we need to be extremely careful. If the mole realizes we're closing in on them, they might do something desperate. Like what? Wheeler's expression was grim. Like eliminating the people investigating them. Or worse, like ensuring that the missing crew members of the New Horizon never make it home. As they wrapped up their meeting, Sarah realized that her investigation had reached a critical juncture. She now had enough information to write a significant story about Operation Silent Current and the security breach that had compromised it. But publishing that story might endanger the missing crew members and alert the mole to their investigation. She was caught between her duty as a journalist to inform the public and her responsibility to protect the lives of innocent people who had been caught up in a covert military operation. The decision she made in the next few days would determine not just the direction of her investigation, but potentially the fate of 15 missing civilians and the security of American intelligence operations in the Pacific. As Wheeler drove her back to her car, Sarah made a mental commitment to pursue the investigation with everything she had. 15 people were missing. A traitor was operating within the highest levels of the military, and American national security was at risk. The story that had begun with a chance encounter outside a nightclub had become the most important investigation of her career. The question now was whether she could solve it before more people disappeared into the dark waters of the South China Sea. Sarah spent the next 3 days conducting the most intensive investigation of her career. Working from her apartment with multiple laptops, secure phone lines, and stacks of printed documents, she dove deep into the backgrounds of the 4 remaining suspects. Her journalism training had taught her that the truth usually lay hidden in seemingly mundane details: financial records, travel patterns, personal relationships, and digital footprints that most people never realized they were leaving behind. Admiral Richardson, the commanding officer of Pacific Fleet Operations, presented the most complex profile. His military record was exemplary: 32 years of distinguished service, multiple combat deployments, and a reputation for uncompromising integrity. His financial records showed a modest lifestyle consistent with military pay, with no unusual transactions or unexplained wealth. But Sarah's research revealed something interesting in his travel history. 6 months before Operation Silent Current began experiencing security breaches, Admiral Richardson had taken a 2-week leave to visit his sister in Hawaii. However, Sarah's cross-reference of flight records showed that Richardson had actually flown to Bangkok, Thailand, not Hawaii. The discrepancy was small, but it was the kind of deception that intelligence officers were trained to notice. Captain Torres, the intelligence chief, had an equally distinguished record, but with some notable quirks. His financial records showed regular payments to a therapist specializing in PTSD treatment. Not unusual for a career military officer, but potentially significant if Torres was struggling with psychological issues that might make him vulnerable to manipulation. More concerning were his communication patterns. Torres made unusually frequent international phone calls to numbers in the Philippines, well beyond what would be expected for official duties. Commander Nash, the communications director, appeared to be the most straightforward of the suspects on the surface. His record was solid, but not exceptional. His finances were unremarkable, and his personal life seemed stable with a wife and 2 children. However, Sarah discovered that Nash's wife had been born in China and had immigrated to the United States 15 years earlier. While intermarriage was common in military families, the connection to China raised obvious security concerns. Major Kim, the logistics coordinator, was the youngest of the suspects and the most recently promoted to a position with silent current access. His background check revealed something that the others lacked: significant financial pressure. Kim was supporting his elderly parents and paying for his daughter's medical treatment for a rare genetic disorder. His family's medical expenses were substantial and ongoing, creating exactly the kind of financial vulnerability that foreign intelligence services typically exploited. After compiling detailed profiles of all 4 suspects, Sarah began looking for connections between their activities and the timing of the security breaches. She created a timeline that mapped each compromised operation against the suspects' schedules, travel, communications, and financial activities. The pattern that emerged was subtle but significant. In each case where assets were lost, Major Kim had been working extended shifts in the days immediately preceding the security breach. His duty log showed that he had accessed classified scheduling systems during off hours, ostensibly to coordinate logistics for legitimate operations. But Sarah's analysis of Kim's access patterns revealed something troubling. He had been accessing operational schedules for missions well outside his normal area of responsibility. A logistics coordinator would typically need to know about supply runs and equipment maintenance, but Kim had been reviewing surveillance deployment schedules and communication protocols that were far beyond his official duties. On Wednesday morning, Sarah called Wheeler with her findings. "I think we need to focus on Major Kim," she said, keeping her voice low, even though she was alone in her apartment. "His access patterns and financial situation make him the most likely candidate." Wheeler was quiet for a moment. "Kim's a good officer," he said finally. "I've worked with him for 2 years. He's dedicated, reliable, never given anyone reason for concern." "Which would make him perfect for recruitment by foreign intelligence," Sarah pointed out. "Good officers with financial pressures and access to sensitive information are exactly what the Chinese look for." "What do you need to confirm your theory?" Sarah had been thinking about this question for hours. "I need to see Kim's communication records, personal phone calls, emails, any contact with people outside the military. If he's been recruited by Chinese intelligence, there will be traces of that contact somewhere. I can't access personal communication records without triggering security alerts," Wheeler said. That kind of surveillance requires approval from Admiral Richardson himself. Then, we need to find another way, Sarah replied. What about his financial records? Can you access more detailed information about his banking activity? Wheeler was quiet again, and Sarah could hear the internal struggle in his silence. What she was asking him to do constituted unauthorized surveillance of a fellow officer, the kind of activity that would end his career if discovered. "Give me 24 hours, Wheeler said finally. "I'll see what I can find." That afternoon, Sarah decided to take a more direct approach. She drove to the neighborhood where Major Kim lived with his family, a modest residential area about 15 minutes from the naval base. She wasn't planning to confront Kim directly. That would be too dangerous if he was indeed a Chinese agent. Instead, she wanted to observe his daily routines and look for any behaviors that might support her theory. Kim's house was a small two-story home with a well-maintained yard and children's toys visible in the driveway. Sarah parked across the street and settled in to watch, using a telephoto lens to document Kim's activities without being obvious about her surveillance. For 3 hours, she observed what appeared to be a completely normal family life. Kim's wife tended to their garden while their young daughter played nearby. Kim himself appeared around 6 p.m., still in uniform, and spent time playing with his daughter before helping to bring groceries in from the car. Sarah was beginning to think her surveillance was pointless when she noticed something interesting. While Kim was playing with his daughter in the backyard, his phone rang. Instead of answering it immediately, Kim looked around carefully, then walked to the far corner of the yard, the area with the most privacy from neighboring houses, before taking the call. The conversation lasted about 10 minutes, and Sarah could see Kim's body language become tense as the call progressed. He glanced repeatedly toward his house, as if making sure his family couldn't overhear, and at one point he pulled out what appeared to be a small notebook and wrote something down. When the call ended, Kim stood in the corner of his yard for several more minutes, staring at his phone. Then, he deleted something. Sarah couldn't tell if it was the call log, a text message, or something else, before walking back toward his house with a forced smile for his family. Sarah photographed the entire sequence, noting the time and Kim's behavior patterns. The secretive phone call wasn't proof of anything criminal, but it was the kind of behavior she would expect from someone who was communicating with handlers they couldn't afford to have traced back to them. That evening, Wheeler called with disturbing news. "I accessed Kim's financial records," he said without preamble. "His daughter's medical expenses are much worse than I realized. She needs a specialized treatment that costs over $200,000, and their insurance won't cover it." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. That's exactly the kind of financial pressure that intelligence services exploit. "It gets worse," Wheeler continued. 3 months ago, Kim received a wire transfer for $50,000 from a financial services company in Singapore. The transfer was labeled as an investment return, but I can't find any record of Kim having made investments with that company. The pieces were falling into place with frightening clarity. A military officer with access to classified information, facing enormous financial pressure from his daughter's medical needs, receiving mysterious payments from a company that probably served as a front for intelligence operations. It was a textbook example of how foreign agents recruited sources within the American military. "We need more evidence before we can act on this," Sarah said. "If we're wrong about Kim, we'll destroy the career of an innocent officer. If we're right, but can't prove it, he'll disappear, and we'll never save those missing crew members. What do you suggest?" Sarah had been thinking about this dilemma all day. "We need to catch him in the act of passing information. Set up a situation where he has access to false intelligence that we can track when it gets to the Chinese." Wheeler understood immediately. A honey trap operation. feed him fake information, and see if it shows up in Chinese actions. Exactly. Can you create a false operational schedule? Something that would look legitimate to Kim, but that we could monitor to see if the Chinese respond to it. I think so, Wheeler said slowly. But it would be incredibly risky. If Kim realizes he's being tested, he could run or do something desperate. And if we're wrong about him being the mole, we might be exposing legitimate operations for nothing. Sarah realized they were approaching the most dangerous phase of their investigation. If Major Kim was indeed the traitor responsible for the loss of American intelligence assets and the disappearance of 15 civilian crew members, they needed to expose him quickly before more people were endangered. But if they were wrong, their unauthorized investigation could destroy innocent careers and compromise legitimate operations. There's one more thing, Wheeler said. I did some checking on that wire transfer Kim received. The Singapore financial company that sent the money has been flagged by Treasury as a suspected front for Chinese intelligence operations. That was the confirmation Sarah needed. The pattern was now clear. Major Kim had been recruited by Chinese intelligence, was using his access to Pacific Fleet communications to feed operational information to his handlers, and was being paid for his treason through a Singapore front company. The question now was how to expose him without endangering the missing crew members or alerting Chinese intelligence that their operation had been discovered. We need to move fast, Sarah said. If Kim realizes he's under suspicion, he might try to eliminate evidence or flee the country. Agreed, Wheeler replied. I'll work on setting up the honey trap operation. You focus on documenting everything we've discovered so far. If something happens to us, someone needs to have a complete record of what we found. As Sarah hung up the phone, she realized that her investigation had reached its climax. Within the next few days, they would either expose a traitor and potentially save 15 missing civilians, or they would trigger a security crisis that could endanger American intelligence operations throughout the Pacific. The story that had begun with a chance encounter outside a nightclub was about to reach its dramatic conclusion. Sarah just hoped that conclusion would include bringing the missing crew of the New Horizon safely home. The next morning would bring the final confrontation, and Sarah knew that everything, the lives of the missing crew members, the security of American operations in the Pacific, and the careers of everyone involved in the investigation, hung in the balance. Major Kim's secret was about to be exposed, and the consequences would reverberate far beyond the quiet suburban neighborhood where he lived with his family, unaware that his world was about to collapse around him.